The whiteboard stretched 12 feet across the conference room wall, covered in equations that had consumed 3 days and 7 of SpaceX's best minds. Elon Musk stood before it at 11:47 p.m., his hands pressed against his temples, studying the maze of variables that refused to cooperate. The propulsion efficiency problem should have been solvable. The Raptor engine modifications needed a 12% thrust increase without compromising fuel consumption. Basic rocket science. He'd told his team that morning. Now the mockery of his own words stared back at him in red marker corrections and crossed out attempts. Sir, Elon turned. Maria Santos, his lead propulsion engineer, stood in the doorway with her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Go home, Maria. We'll crack it tomorrow. She hesitated. The launch window. I know. He waved her off. 3 weeks. We'll make it work. Maria left, and silence filled the room except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Elon pulled out his phone, scrolled through messages he didn't want to read, then set it aside. He picked up a blue marker and approached the board again. The sound of a mop bucket wheels squeaking down the hallway broke his concentration. Through the glass wall, he watched a man in gray coveralls push a cleaning cart past the conference room. The man moved with deliberate precision, not the rush efficiency of someone eager to finish, but the careful rhythm of someone who had learned to make time disappear through repetition. Elon returned to the equation. He tried rearranging the thrust-to-weight ratio variables, but the numbers led to the same impossible conclusion. You couldn't increase thrust without burning more fuel. Physics didn't negotiate. The mop bucket squeaking stopped. When Elon looked up, the dishwasher stood outside the glass wall, staring at the whiteboard. Not glancing, staring. His dark eyes moved across the equations with the focus of someone reading a book, not cleaning a hallway. The man caught Elon watching and quickly looked down, resuming his mopping with sudden urgency. He moved away from the conference room, the squeaking fading down the corridor. Elon studied the man's retreating figure. Medium height, maybe 60 years old, with graying hair and hands that moved with surprising delicacy around the mop handle. In 3 years of late-night sessions at the facility, Elon had seen dozens of cleaning staff, but something about this man's stillness while looking at the board felt different. He shook his head and returned to problem. By 12:30 a.m., he'd filled 2 more sections of whiteboard with failed attempts. His phone buzzed with a text from Grimes asking if he was coming home. He typed back, working late. Don't wait up. At 1:15 a.m., Elon finally surrendered. He gathered his notebook and jacket, taking one last look at the equation that had defeated him. Tomorrow he'd bring in consultants from MIT, maybe Caltech. Someone had to see what they were missing. He turned off the lights and walked to his car through empty hallways that smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet defeat. The next morning, Elon arrived at 7 a.m. with coffee and grim determination. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling through potential solutions that dissolved under mathematical scrutiny. The launch timeline couldn't slip. NASA was watching. The press was watching. 3 weeks to solve what stumped his best engineers. He pushed open the conference room door and stopped. Someone had been at the whiteboard. Not erased, modified. 3 lines of his work had been altered with green marker. Small changes. A variable repositioned here. A coefficient adjusted there. An entirely new approach to the combustion chamber pressure calculations. Elon approached the board slowly, reading the modifications. His chest tightened as he followed the logic. The changes were elegant, precise, and he grabbed his phone and opened the calculator app. Mathematically sound. The green marker additions solved the problem. Whoever had done this understood advanced propulsion engineering well enough to spot flaws that had escaped 7 MIT and Caltech graduates. They'd seen solutions that Elon himself had missed. He photographed the board, then called Maria. Get in here now. Bring the team. Elon, it's 7:15. Now. 20 minutes later, 5 engineers stood in the conference room staring at the modified equations. Maria ran calculations on her laptop, while David Chun, their combustion specialist, traced the green additions with his finger. "This actually works," David said quietly. "Who did this?" Maria asked. Elon studied the handwriting. Clean, confident strokes with no hesitation marks. The person who'd written this knew exactly what they were doing before they picked up the marker. "Security footage," he said. "I want to see who was in this room between midnight and 7 a.m. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Frank, pulled up the footage on his monitor. Elon watched himself leave the building at 1:22 a.m. The timestamp jumped to 2:45 a.m. when motion sensors triggered recording again. A figure in gray coveralls entered the conference room. The dishwasher. The man moved directly to the whiteboard without hesitation, as if he'd been thinking about those equations since he'd seen them the night before. He studied the work for perhaps 30 seconds, then picked up the green marker. For 8 minutes, he made precise modifications. No trial and error. No false starts. He worked with the confidence of someone who saw the solution immediately and simply needed time to write it down. When finished, he stepped back, nodded once at his work, and left the room. "Damn, son," Frank muttered. "Your dishwasher's a rocket scientist." Elon watched the footage 3 more times. The man's body language showed no uncertainty, no guesswork. This wasn't luck or intuition. This was expertise. "What's his name?" Elon asked. Frank checked his clipboard. "Viktor Petrov. Been here 18 months. Background check came back clean. Former academic. Immigrated from Eastern Europe in '98. Academic in what? Doesn't say. Just says he had university credentials that didn't transfer. Happens a lot with immigrants." Elon stared at the frozen image of Viktor Petrov standing before the whiteboard, marker in hand, solving in minutes what had taken Elon's team days to fail at. Viktor Petrov arrived at SpaceX each morning at 5 a.m., 2 hours before his ship began. He sat in his 1994 Honda Civic in an employee parking lot, drinking coffee from a thermos and reading scientific journals he printed at the public library. This morning routine had been unbroken for 18 months. He did not read for pleasure. He read to maintain what remained a mind that had once solved problems most people couldn't understand. The journals kept him sharp in a life that had grown deliberately dull. At 7 a.m., he changed into gray coveralls in the staff bathroom and began his rounds. Cafeteria first, clearing tables, loading dishwashers, wiping down surfaces. The work required no thought, which was precisely why he'd chosen it. For 8 hours, his hands stayed busy while his mind could rest. He had not always lived this way. In 1987, Viktor Petrov was the youngest department head in the history of Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. His specialty was theoretical propulsion systems, the mathematical frameworks that would someday power spacecraft to Mars and beyond. Soviet newspapers called him the future of space exploration. American journals translated his papers. Students competed for seats in his lectures. That life ended on a Tuesday in November 1991. The university rector called him into his office that morning. Viktor expected to discuss his latest research proposal, a breakthrough in ion drive efficiency that could revolutionize satellite propulsion. Instead, 3 men in dark suits sat behind the rector's desk. "Professor Petrov," the rector began, "allegations have been made regarding your recent publications." The allegations were simple. Viktor had been sharing theoretical advances with Western researchers. His collaborations with American physicists, which had been encouraged under Gorbachev's reforms, were now considered security breaches. His research was classified. His intentions were suspect. None of it was true, But truth had become a luxury the new Russian government couldn't afford. "You have two choices," one of the suited men said. "Face formal charges and trial, or disappear quietly. Your academic credentials will be revoked. Your research will be attributed to state institutions. Your name will be removed from all publications." Victor looked at the rector, a man who had been his mentor for 15 years. The rector wouldn't meet his eyes. "If I choose to disappear, you leave Russia within 30 days. You never publish under your name again. You never claim credit for work done here." Victor walked home through Moscow streets he would never see again. His apartment contained 20 years of research notes, award from international physics societies, and photographs from conferences where his ideas had shaped the future. He burned them all in the building's courtyard that night. 6 weeks later, Viktor Petrov stood in the immigration line at John F. Kennedy Airport with a single suitcase and a tourist visa that would expire in 3 months. He spoke broken English and had no American credentials. The work that had made him famous belonged to someone else now. He spent his first American year washing dishes at a Russian restaurant in Brooklyn, sleeping on a couch in the owner's apartment. His English improved through watching television and reading discarded newspapers. His hands grew rough from hot water and industrial soap. He applied for asylum status. The paperwork required proof of persecution, which meant explaining why a respected physics professor had fled Russia with nothing. Victor wrote the truth. His collaboration with Western scientists had been reframed as espionage. He submitted evidence of his published work, letters from American colleagues, conference photographs. The asylum application was denied. The immigration officer, a tired woman with stacks of similar cases on her desk, explained that academic disputes didn't qualify as persecution. Victor could return to Russia or remain illegally. He chose to disappear into the vast anonymity of American immigrant labor. For 7 years, Victor worked construction in New Jersey, learning to use tools instead of equations. He sent no letters to former colleagues. He published no papers. He attended no conferences. The brilliant physicist who had once glimpsed the mathematical structure of interplanetary travel learned to install drywall and tile bathrooms. In 2005, he moved to California and found work at a semiconductor plant. The technology fascinated him. Microprocessors contained the same elegant mathematical relationships he'd once explored in propulsion systems, but he kept his insights to himself. Viktor Petrov, the physicist, was dead. Viktor Petrov, the maintenance worker, had learned the value of silence. When SpaceX began operations, Victor read about Elon Musk's vision with quiet amazement. Here was someone attempting exactly what Victor had dreamed about in Moscow: private spacecraft capable of reaching Mars. The mathematics underlying Musk's rockets were variations on problems Victor had solved decades earlier. He applied for a cleaning position at SpaceX not because he needed the work, but because he wanted to be near the cutting edge of aerospace engineering again, even if only to empty trash cans and mop floors. For 18 months, he'd listened to engineers discuss problems he could solve in his sleep. He'd seen them make elementary mistakes, pursue dead-end approaches, overlook obvious solutions. He'd watched them struggle with equations he'd mastered before some of them were born. He said nothing. Silence had kept him safe for 27 years. But last night, staring at that whiteboard, the problem had been so simple and the solution so clear that Victor's hand had moved before his caution could stop it. For 8 minutes, he'd felt like a physicist again. Now, as he pushed his cleaning cart past the conference room where a crowd of engineers studied his work, Victor realized the silence was about to end. Elon stood in his office reviewing Viktor Petrov's employment file. The background check revealed almost nothing. Divorced, no children, clean driving record, previous employment at various maintenance and construction jobs stretching back to 1998. The file mentioned 4 university credentials, but provided no details. Dig deeper. Elon told his head of security, Janet Kim, "This man solved a propulsion problem my best engineers couldn't crack. I need to know who he really is." Janet nodded and left. Elon returned to the security footage, watching Victor work at the whiteboard frame by frame. The man's posture, the way he held a marker, the confidence of his strokes. None of it looked like someone guessing. It looked like someone remembering. 2 hours later, Janet returned with a folder. Viktor Petrov, age 64, immigrated to the U.S. in 1992, applied for political asylum, was denied, has been working manual labor jobs ever since. She paused. But here's what's interesting. I ran his name through academic databases. There was a Viktor Petrov who published extensively in theoretical physics journals from 1985 to 1991. Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. Elon opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of research papers written in dense mathematical language. The author photo showed a younger man with the same dark eyes as a dishwasher, but everything else was different. Confident posture, expensive suit, the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. Same person. Has to be. The immigration records show he entered the U.S. 3 months after the last publication date. And look at this. Janet handed him a translated abstract from a 1990 paper titled Theoretical Frameworks for Ion Drive Optimization in Deep Space Applications. Elon read it twice, his chest tightening with recognition. The mathematical approaches described in Victor's 25-year-old paper were the foundation for several propulsion systems SpaceX was currently developing. Ideas Elon had thought were cutting-edge innovations had been explored decades earlier by the man who now cleaned his conference rooms. Jesus, Elon whispered. He continued reading. Victor's research had covered theoretical work that wouldn't be practically implemented until companies like SpaceX had the funding and technology to attempt it. The man had been 20 years ahead of his time. Why did he stop publishing? I'm still researching that, but I found something else. Janet pulled out another document. Dr. Sarah Chun at Caltech. She consulted for us on combustion chamber design. I called her about the propulsion problem you solved yesterday. She recognized the mathematical approach immediately. From where? A conference she attended as a graduate student in 1991. MIT hosted a symposium on theoretical propulsion systems. Viktor Petrov was the keynote speaker. Dr. Chin said his presentation was the most elegant explanation of spacecraft propulsion theory she'd ever heard. She kept her notes from that lecture for 30 years. Elon stared at Victor's author photo. Send me Dr. Chen's contact information. I want to talk to her. An hour later, Elon sat in his Tesla Model S in the SpaceX parking lot, talking to Dr. Chen via Bluetooth. The approach she described, the modifications to your propulsion calculations, that's pure Petrov methodology, she said. I haven't seen anyone use those specific mathematical frameworks since the early 90s. It's like seeing someone write with their left hand in a very distinctive way. Tell me about the conference. November 1991, MIT. Viktor Petrov delivered a keynote on theoretical ion propulsion that was decades ahead of practical application. The audience was stunned. We all expected him to revolutionize aerospace engineering within a few years. What happened to him? He disappeared, never published again. Rumors were that he'd gotten into political trouble in Russia. This was right when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Some people said he'd been accused of sharing research with Western scientists. Others thought he'd defected. Nobody knew for sure. Elon watched Victor exit the building through the employee entrance, walking toward his old Honda with the same careful, unremarkable pace he used for everything. Dr. Chun, if I sent you a video of someone working through propulsion calculation, could you identify whether it's the same person? If it's Viktor Petrov? Absolutely. His mathematical thinking was as distinctive as a fingerprint. That evening, Elon sent Dr. Chen the security footage of Victor at the whiteboard. Her response came back within an hour. That's him. I'd stake my reputation on it. Victor Petrov is working at your facility. Elon sat in his home office, staring out at the California hills, trying to process what he'd learned. The man who'd been emptying his trash cans for 18 months was one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of the late 20th century. Someone whose work had influenced the very rocket SpaceX was building. He thought about the mathematics Victor had written on the whiteboard, solutions that had come to him instantly, modifications that showed deep understanding of principles most engineers study for years to grasp. The man had been hiding in plain sight, using his hands for manual labor while his mind contained insights that could accelerate space exploration by decades. But why? Why choose invisibility when you could have influence? Why mop floors when you could be designing spacecraft? Elon picked up his phone and called Janet Kim. I need you to find out everything you can about why Viktor Petrov left Russia. And I want to know what happened to his asylum application. Every detail. Elon, it's almost midnight. This can't wait. I have questions that need answers before I see him tomorrow. The next morning, Victor arrived at 5 a.m. as always. He sat in his Honda drinking coffee, but instead of reading journals, he stared at the SpaceX building where his secret had been discovered. He'd seen the engineers cluster around the conference room yesterday, studying his work, photographing the whiteboard. He'd watched Elon Musk himself trace the green marker corrections with obvious fascination. 27 years of careful invisibility were ending. The question was what would replace them. At 7:05 a.m., as Victor walked toward the employee entrance, a black Tesla pulled up beside him. Victor. Elon Musk stepped out of the car. We need to talk. Victor stopped walking but didn't turn around. His hand tightened on the handle of his thermos. I have to clock in, he said in English that still carried traces of Russian accent after 27 years. Clock in later. Elon moved to stand in front of him. I know who you are, Professor Petrov. The title hit Victor like a physical blow. He'd been Victor or Hey You for so long that hearing Professor felt like being called by the name of a dead man. I am Dishwasher, Victor said carefully. Nothing more. Bullshit. Elon gestured toward the building. You solved a propulsion problem my MIT graduates couldn't crack. You did it in 8 minutes. I've read your papers from Moscow Institute. I know what you were. Victor's face remained expressionless, but Elon caught the slight tensing around his eyes. Papers are old. That man is gone. That man wrote the theoretical foundation for half the rockets we're building. That man understood ion propulsion 20 years before we had the technology to implement it. Elon stepped closer. I have questions. Victor looked past Elon toward the building where other early shift workers were arriving. Normal people with normal jobs who didn't have to explain why their past was buried. Sometimes silence is safer, Victor said quietly. Safer than what? Victor turned and walked toward the employee entrance. Elon followed. I researched your asylum application, Elon said. Denied in 1993. The officer noted that academic disputes don't constitute persecution. But it wasn't just an academic dispute, was it? Victor's pace quickened slightly. Your research was classified by the Russian government. Your collaboration with American physicists was reframed as espionage. They gave you a choice: face treason charges or disappear forever. Victor stopped at the employee entrance and pulled out his security badge. His hand was steady, but Elon noticed he was gripping the badge hard enough to leave marks on his palm. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Dr. Sarah Chun from Caltech still has notes from your 1991 MIT lecture. I know she recognized your mathematical approach from the whiteboard corrections. I know that some of the most advanced propulsion theory SpaceX uses traces back to papers you published 30 years ago. Victor swiped his badge and opened the door. Before he could step inside, Elon said, "I also know that your work was stolen." Victor froze. Dr. Chin sent me copies of papers published by the Russian State Institute for Aerospace Engineering in 1992 and 1993. Ion propulsion theories, combustion chamber optimization, theoretical frameworks for Mars mission propulsion systems, all credited to Dr. Mikhail Volkov and the state research team. Victor turned slowly to face Elon. But the mathematical approaches, the specific frameworks, even some of the language, it's identical to your 1989 and 1990 publications. They didn't just erase you from the record. They stole your life's work and gave it to someone else. Victor's composure cracked for just a moment. Elon saw something flash across his face. Not anger, but a deep exhaustion that came from carrying injustice for decades. Dr. Volkov now runs a Russian space program. Elon continued. He's credited as the father of modern Russian propulsion theory. Your propulsion theory. What do you want? Victor's voice was barely above a whisper. I want you to stop emptying trash cans and start solving problems that matter. I want you to help us get to Mars. Victor shook his head. I am not that man anymore. You were that man 3 nights ago when you fixed our propulsion calculations. 3 nights ago was a mistake. 3 nights ago was the most important 8 minutes in SpaceX's development program. Elon stepped closer. Victor, we're launching the most ambitious Mars mission in human history in 18 months. We have problems that need solutions only someone with your expertise can provide. Victor looked through the glass doors at the lobby where other employees were arriving for their shifts. Normal people with normal problems. I have job. Is enough. It's not enough. Not when you could be designing the engines that take humans to another planet. I clean things. Is simple. Is safe. Safe from what? The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The men who destroyed your career are retired or dead. There's no one left to hide from. Victor turned back toward Elon, and for the first time, his careful control wavered. You think it's about hiding? You think I'm afraid of dead men. Then what? Victor was quiet for a long moment. Staring at the building that contained work, he understood better than almost anyone alive. You want to know what happened to Viktor Petrov, the physicist? I will tell you. His accent grew thicker as emotion crept into his voice. In Moscow, I had laboratory. I had graduate students. I had respect. I had future. He paused, gathering himself. I also had son. Alexei, he was 16. Smart boy like his father. He wanted to study physics, maybe work on spacecraft someday. After university, he called me traitor. After they took away my name from my work, Alexei became target at school. Other children said his father was spy, was enemy of state. Elon remained silent. One night, December 1991, Alexei did not come home. Police found him next morning in river. They said it was accident. Boy fell through ice while walking, but ice was thick that winter, and Alexei knew how to swim. Victor's hands were trembling now. They killed my son because of what they did to me, because I collaborated with American scientists, because I shared knowledge that should have belonged to the world, not to one country. He looked directly at Elon. So you ask why I choose simple job, why I stay quiet. Because I learned that brilliance costs too much. Better to be nobody than to lose everything again. Elon felt the weight of Victor's story settle over him. The man hadn't been hiding from professional shame or political persecution. He'd been hiding from the grief that came with understanding how much his ambition had cost. Victor, Elon said quietly, I'm sorry. It's long time ago. But it's not, is it? You've been carrying this for 27 years. Victor didn't answer. Come inside. Let me show you something. Against his better judgment, Victor followed Elon through the lobby and down corridors he usually saw only as places to empty waste baskets. They entered an elevator that required special security clearance, rising to floors Victor had never seen. The elevator opened onto SpaceX's primary engineering lab. Dozens of engineers worked at computer stations surrounded by rocket components, propulsion system prototypes, and whiteboards covered in calculations. The air hummed with focused intelligence and collaborative energy. This is what your son wanted to be part of, Elon said. This is the future you helped create with your theoretical work. Victor walked slowly through the lab, recognizing principles he developed being applied to hardware he'd never imagined would exist. Young engineers, some barely older than Alexei would have been, worked on problems that built directly from foundations Victor had laid decades earlier. Every rocket we launch carries your mathematics, Elon said. Your son's dream of working on spacecraft. It's happening here every day because of work he did in Moscow 30 years ago. Victor stopped at a workstation where two engineers debated combustion chamber pressure optimization. The calculations on their monitors were variations on equations Victor had solved in 1989. They don't know, he said. They should. The whole world should. Victor turned away from the workstation. You wanted to work here. I want you to finish what you started. I want your name on the engines that take humans to Mars. I want Alexei's dream to become reality through his father's work. For a moment, Victor's careful composure wavered completely. Elon saw the physicist he'd been, brilliant, passionate, unafraid of big ideas. Then the walls came back up. I need to think. Take all the time you need. But Victor, Elon waited until Victor met his eyes. Your son will be proud of what you could accomplish here. Don't let the people who took him away from you take away his dreams too. That afternoon, Victor worked his usual shift in mechanical silence. He emptied trash cans that contained sketches of rocket designs based on his theories. He mopped floors where engineers discussed problems he'd solved decades earlier. He cleaned windows that looked out at launch pads where spacecraft built with his mathematics would someday depart from Mars. When his shift ended, instead of going to his apartment, Victor drove to the public library. He checked out books about SpaceX's Mars mission plans, technical journals about current propulsion research, and newspaper articles about the upcoming launch schedule. He read until the library closed, then sat in his Honda in the parking lot, staring at technical diagrams that looked like conversations with his younger self. 3 days passed without Victor saying a word to Elon. He arrived at 5 a.m., worked his shift with quiet efficiency, and left at 3:30 p.m. without making eye contact with any of the engineers. But Elon noticed changes in his routine. Victor lingered near the conference rooms where technical discussions took place. He cleaned more slowly around whiteboards covered with calculations, sometimes stopping entirely to study complex equations. Yesterday, Elon had caught him photographing a propulsion diagram with his phone. On Thursday morning, Elon found Victor in the employee parking lot 2 hours before his shift, sitting in his Honda with engineering journals spread across his dashboard. Elon knocked on the passenger window. Victor looked up, startled, then rolled the window down. Mind if I sit? Victor hesitated, then nodded toward the passenger seat. Elon climbed into the old Honda, which smelled like industrial cleaner and carried particular silence of someone who lived alone. What are you reading? Victor held up a journal article about Mars atmospheric entry challenges. Your engineers are making this too complicated. How so? Victor pointed to a diagram showing heat shield configurations. They are trying to solve wrong problem. Heat dissipation is not primary issue. It is energy conversion. Heat should be used, not dissipated. Use for what? Propulsion adjustment during entry. Convert thermal energy to directional thrust for landing precision. Victor traced equations in the margins he'd apparently worked out himself. Could improve landing accuracy by 300% while reducing fuel requirements. Elon studied Victor's handwritten calculations. The mathematics were elegant and appeared sound, approaching the atmospheric entry problem from an angle that hadn't occurred to SpaceX's landing systems team. Victor, this is break-the-level thinking, is obvious solution if you approach from thermodynamics perspective instead of materials engineering. It's not obvious to anyone else. Victor closed a journal and stacked it with the others. I should not have said anything. Why? Victor stared through the windshield at the SpaceX building. Because once I start talking about physics, I cannot stop. Because once I start solving problems, I remember who I used to be. And that's bad. Is dangerous. Makes me forget why I chose simple life. Elon watched Victor's hands as he organized the journals. Even this mundane task was performed with the precision he brought to everything. The careful attention to detail of someone who'd learned that small mistakes could have enormous consequences. Tell me about Alexei, Elon said quietly. Victor's hand stopped moving. You don't want to hear old man's grief. I want to understand why you're afraid to be brilliant again. Victor was quiet for several minutes. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Alexei was born in 1975. Smart boy, but not like his father. He was interested in practical applications, not theory. He wanted to build things, to see ideas become real. Victor's voice softened. When he was 14, he built radio from spare parts. Not from kit, from pieces he found in an electronics shop. He understood how theory becomes practice. Victor pulled out his wallet and removed a photograph that had been folded and unfolded so many times the edges were soft. It showed a teenage boy with Victor's dark eyes and an expression of intense curiosity, holding what appeared to be a homemade device. He built this in 1990. Radio telescope for listening to satellite transmissions. He wanted to hear cosmonauts talking to ground control. Victor smiled for the first time since Elon had known him. He was very excited about space program. Said someday he would work on spacecraft that go to Mars. He sounds remarkable. He was target because of me. The smile disappeared. After they destroyed my career, Alexei's teachers began treating him differently. Other students called him son of traitor. He came home with bruises, torn clothes, but he never complained. Victor refolded the photograph carefully. December 15th, 1991. Alexei stayed after school to use physics laboratory. Teacher had given him permission to work on project, some kind of propulsion experiment with model rockets. He was trying to prove his father was not traitor, was trying to show that physics is not political. Victor's breathing had become shallow. He left school at 6 p.m. Walk home normally took 20 minutes. When he was not home by 8 p.m., I went looking. Found his backpack near a river. Inside was notebook with the propulsion calculations and letter he had written to me. What did the letter say? That he understood why I had collaborated with American scientists. That science belongs to everyone, not just one country. That he was proud his father chose truth over politics. Victor's voice broke slightly. That he wanted to finish my work someday, wanted to help build spacecraft that would unite world instead of dividing it. They sat in silence for several minutes. Police never investigated properly. Said it was accident, case closed. But I know what happened. People who destroyed my career decided Petrov family was still dangerous, even in disgrace. Victor, you want to know why I chose to be nobody? Because being somebody killed my son. Because my ambition, my need to share knowledge with the whole world, it made me target. And targets do not get to keep what they love. Victor started the Honda's engine. "I must clock in now." "Wait!" Elon put his hand on Victor's arm. "There's something you need to see." They drove in silence to a hill overlooking SpaceX's launch site. Victor had never been here before, though he lived only 10 miles away. From this vantage point, they could see the entire facility, launch pads, assembly buildings, fuel tanks, and a rocket that would carry the next Mars mission. "Every 3 months," Elon said, "we do an unmanned test launch. System checks, trajectory verification, engine performance analysis. The next one is tomorrow at 6 a.m. Victor stared at the rocket that would someday carry human beings to another planet. People come here to watch. Families, kids, aerospace engineering students. They bring telescopes and cameras. They cheer when the engines light up." Elon pointed to an area near the base of the hill, where cars were already gathering for tomorrow's launch. "But there's one person who comes to every launch alone. Parks up here where no one else can see him. Watches through binoculars." Victor's face went pale. "You've been watching us for 18 months, Victor. Every single launch. You park in that exact spot where you can see everything, but no one can see you." Victor's hands gripped the steering wheel. "You know why you come here? It's not just curiosity. It's because this is what Alexei wanted to be part of. This is his dream, continuing without him." "You are wrong." "I'm not wrong. You come here because watching those rockets launch is the closest you can get to your son. Because every time we send something into space, you're honoring what he believed in." Victor shut off the engine and sat staring at the launch site. He would have been 44 years old now. Victor said quietly. "Would have had children of his own. Maybe would have been engineer, probably working on spacecraft like these. He still can be. He is dead. His dreams aren't." Elon turned to face Victor directly. "Every rocket we launch carries a piece of what Alexei believed in, that science belongs to everyone, that space exploration can unite humanity instead of dividing it. Your son's vision is happening right here every day." Victor closed his eyes. "You think I have not thought about this? You think I do not know that my son would want me to be physicist again?" His voice was thick with emotion he'd kept buried for decades. "But what if I fail? What if I am not as brilliant as I once was? What if 27 years of silence have made me ordinary? Then you'll still be doing something that matters. You'll still be finishing what Alexei started." Victor opened his eyes and looked at the rocket that would launch tomorrow. "There is something else," he said quietly. "Something I have not told you." "What?" Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook, its cover soft with age and handling. "Alexei's propulsion calculations. From the day he died. I have been working on them for 27 years. He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with equations in 2 different handwritings, a teenager's careful printing and an adult's refined script. Victor's additions spanned decades, building on his son's foundational ideas with mathematical sophistication that turned a high school physics project into graduate-level aerospace engineering. He was trying to design more efficient rocket fuel mixture. Basic idea, but approach was clever. I have been improving his work, making it real." Elon studied the pages. What he saw made his chest tighten. The notebook contained propulsion innovations that could revolutionize spacecraft fuel efficiency. Ideas that built from a teenager's curiosity into mathematical frameworks more advanced than anything SpaceX was currently developing. "Victor, this is extraordinary work. Is Alexei's work. I am just translator. It's both of your work. Father and son collaborating across time." Victor closed a notebook and held it against his chest. "If I agree to help you, if I return to physics, it is not for myself. It is not for recognition or career or anything like that. What would it be for? For him. So his ideas do not die with old man and Honda. So somewhere in the universe, spacecraft fly with mathematics that began in 16-year-old boy's mind. They sat in silence, watching the sun set behind the rocket that would launch tomorrow. Victor had made his decision, but he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. "There is one condition," Victor said finally. "Name it." "When the work is published, when the spacecraft fly, I want his name there too. Not Viktor Petrov, brilliant physicist. Viktor and Alexei Petrov, father and son, theoretical propulsion systems." Done. And no fame, no interviews, no publicity. I work quietly like always, but this time I work on things that matter. Whatever you need. Victor started the engine again, but he didn't put the car in gear. "Tomorrow after launch, I will not come to work as dishwasher. I will come as physicist." "Are you sure?" Victor looked at the notebook containing his son's ideas and 27 years of his own hidden brilliance. Alexei believed science should unite world, not divide it. Tomorrow, we begin proving he was right. That evening, Victor sat in his small apartment for the last time as a dishwasher. The space reflected a life deliberately kept simple. A single bedroom, kitchen table that doubled as a desk, bookshelves lined with physics journals he'd been collecting for decades. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a rocket, was the only photograph he'd ever displayed. Alexei at 14, grinning while holding his homemade radio telescope. Victor opened a bottle of vodka he'd been saving for no particular occasion and poured a small glass. He raised it toward the photograph. "Tomorrow, I return to physics, Alexei. Not for me, for you, for the dreams you never got to finish." He drank, feeling the burn that reminded him of Moscow winters and a life that had ended 34 years ago. Then he opened Alexei's notebook and began writing detailed notes about the atmospheric entry calculations he'd discussed with Elon. If he was going to be a physicist again, he would do it properly. The next morning, Victor arrived at SpaceX at 5 a.m. as always, but instead of gray coveralls, he wore slacks and a button-down shirt he'd bought at a thrift store the night before. Instead of a cleaning cart, he carried a briefcase containing Alexei's notebook, his own research journals, and copies of papers he'd written in Moscow 3 decades earlier. Elon was waiting in the lobby. "Ready for this?" Victor adjusted his collar nervously. "I have not been physicist for a very long time. Maybe I have forgotten how to think properly. Yesterday you solved atmospheric entry problems my best engineers couldn't crack. You haven't forgotten anything." They rode the elevator to the engineering floors Victor had only glimpsed during his conversation with Elon. Now he would work here, contribute here, be valued here for his mind rather than his ability to clean quietly and disappear. "There's something you should know," Elon said as they approached the laboratory. "I've assembled a small team to work on the Mars atmospheric entry problem. Dr. Sarah Chun from Caltech, the one who remembered your 1991 lecture. Dr. James Rodriguez from MIT. He's our lead atmospheric dynamics specialist. And a few younger engineers who are brilliant but need guidance from someone with your theoretical background." Victor stopped walking. "You told them about me?" "I told them we were bringing in a consultant with unique expertise in theoretical propulsion systems. Dr. Chin knows who you are, but I let her decide whether to share that with the others." They entered a conference room where 4 people sat around a table covered with laptops, technical drawings, and coffee cups. Victor recognized Dr. Chin immediately. Older now, but still carry herself with the confidence he remembered from that MIT symposium 31 years ago. "Dr. Petrov," she said, standing to shake his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you properly." The other team members looked up with curiosity. Victor realized they were waiting for him to say something, to establish his authority, to demonstrate the expertise that justified his presence. For a moment, he felt like an imposter in clothes that didn't quite fit, pretending to be someone he'd forgotten how to be. Then he saw the whiteboard covered with atmospheric entry calculations, and the physicist in him awakened. "You are approaching heat dissipation from wrong angle," Victor said, moving toward the board. "Problem is not how to reduce thermal energy. Problem is how to convert thermal energy into useful work." Dr. Rodriguez, a man in his 40s with the intense focus Victor remembered from his best graduate students, leaned forward. "Conver, how?" Victor picked up a marker and began writing equations that built on the work already displayed. Spacecraft entering Mars' atmosphere generates enormous thermal energy through friction. Current approach treats this as waste product to be minimized. Better approach treats this as energy source to be harvested. He worked silently for 10 minutes, developing mathematical frameworks that transformed atmospheric entry from an obstacle into an opportunity. The room grew quiet except for the sound of marker on whiteboard and Victor's occasional murmur in Russian as he worked through complex calculations. When he finished, the board contained a complete theoretical system for converting atmospheric entry heat into directional thrust, allowing spacecraft to adjust trajectory and landing location with precision that exceeded anything currently possible. "Jesus," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, "this is revolutionary." Victor set down the marker and turned to face the team. "Is obvious solution once you stop thinking like engineers and start thinking like physicists." Dr. Chin smiled. "I haven't seen anyone work through thermodynamics that elegantly since." She paused, looking at Victor meaningfully. "Since a certain lecture I attended as a graduate student." The younger engineers began asking questions about implementation, practical applications, testing protocols. Victor found himself explaining complex concepts with a clarity that had once made him Moscow's most popular physics professor. The mathematics came back to him not as memory, but as instinct, as natural as breathing. For 3 hours, they worked through the theoretical framework Victor had outlined. By the end of the session, they had the foundation for atmospheric entry technology that could revolutionize Mars missions and deep space exploration. Victor felt more alive than he had in 27 years. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Chen approached him privately. "I need to ask, are you planning to publish this work under your own name?" Victor thought about this question he'd been avoiding. "I am not sure. Name carries complications." "Victor, you were erased from physics history for political reasons that no longer exist. Your work was stolen and credited to others. You have the right to reclaim your legacy. It is not about rights. It is about what serves science best. What serves science best is honest attribution. The atmospheric entry work you just presented builds directly from theoretical frameworks you developed in Moscow. The world should know that." Victor looked at the whiteboard where his equations had transformed a practical engineering problem into elegant mathematics. "Perhaps, but slowly. I need time to remember how to be physicist without forgetting lessons I learned as dishwasher." Dr. Chen nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'm honored to work with you again." That afternoon, Victor called his landlord and gave notice on his apartment. If he was going to be a physicist again, he needed a space where he could think, write, and remember who he'd been without hiding from who he'd become. 3 weeks later, Victor moved into a small house near the SpaceX facility. The previous tenant had been an engineer who'd left built-in whiteboards in the home office and living room. Victor kept them, covering the walls with equations that spanned from Alexei's teenage insights to cutting-edge propulsion theory. He established new routines that honored both his past and present. Every morning at 5 a.m., he still drank coffee and read scientific journals, but now he took notes intended for publication rather than personal curiosity. He worked at SpaceX until 3:30 p.m., then spent evenings developing Alexei's propulsion ideas into mathematical frameworks sophisticated enough for practical implementation. On weekends, he drove to the hill overlooking the launch site, But now he brought a telescope and notebook, observing rocket launches with the analytical eye of someone contributing to their success rather than simply witnessing their achievement. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Victor discovered that 27 years of silence had given him a caution that sometimes hindered the bold thinking physics required. He'd grown accustomed to hiding his insights, to avoiding attention, to treating brilliance as dangerous rather than valuable. Dr. Chen proved instrumental in helping him rediscover his voice. She would challenge his ideas, demand explanations, push him to defend his theories with the intellectual aggression he'd once thrived on. Slowly, Victor remembered how to argue about mathematics, how to pursue elegant solutions without apology, how to trust his instincts when they led to unexpected conclusions. Dr. Rodriguez became equally important as a collaborator who could translate Victor's theoretical insights into practical engineering applications. Where Victor saw mathematical beauty, Rodriguez saw hardware possibilities. Their collaboration produced innovations neither could have achieved alone. The younger engineers, David Chun, Dr. Chen's nephew, Maria Santos, and James Kim, represented the future Victor was helping to create. Working with them reminded him daily why science mattered, why collaboration across generations could produce breakthroughs that individual brilliance couldn't match. 6 months into his new life as a physicist, Victor made a decision that would have seemed impossible when he'd been cleaning SpaceX's floors. He submitted his first academic paper in 34 years. The paper, titled Theoretical Frameworks for Atmospheric Entry Energy Conversion with Applications to Mars Landing Systems, was co-authored with Dr. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez. It presented the mathematical foundations Victor had developed for converting thermal energy into directional thrust, with practical engineering applications that could be implemented within existing spacecraft designs. Victor insisted on specific attribution language that acknowledged the paper's origins, foundational concepts developed by A. Petrov, 1975 to 1991, and refined through collaborative research at SpaceX. Alexei's name appeared first in the acknowledgments, followed by a note explaining that the theoretical work built from ideas originally conceived by a 16-year-old student whose dreams of space exploration had inspired decades of subsequent research. When the paper was accepted by the Journal of Spacecraft and Rockets with minimal revisions, Victor felt a satisfaction he'd forgotten was possible. Not the satisfaction of personal achievement, but the deeper fulfillment of contributing knowledge that could advance human understanding and capability. The publication attracted attention from aerospace researchers worldwide. Victor began receiving emails from physicists and engineers who wanted to collaborate, build on his ideas, or simply understand how concepts from the early 1990s had evolved into practical 21st century applications. He answered every email carefully, sharing insights while maintaining a collaborative approach he'd learned from watching his son's dreams survive across decades. Victor had discovered that the best way to honor Alexei's memory wasn't to reclaim individual credit, but to ensure that good ideas continued growing regardless of who received recognition. Dr. Chen suggested that Victor consider attending the International Astronautical Congress, the premier global conference for space exploration research. For 34 years, Victor had avoided such gatherings, unwilling to risk questions about his disappearance from physics or recognition that might endanger the anonymity he'd cultivated. "Times have changed, Victor," she said as they worked late one evening in the SpaceX laboratory. "The Soviet Union is gone. The people who destroyed your career are retired or dead. You're free to be a physicist again." Victor looked at the equations covering the laboratory whiteboards, work that built from his son's teenage curiosity into mathematical frameworks that would power the next generation of space exploration. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but slowly, I am still remembering how to be visible without being vulnerable." 6 months later, Victor Petrov walked through SpaceX's Advanced Propulsion Laboratory, wearing a white coat instead of gray coveralls. His badge now read Senior Research Physicist instead of Maintenance Staff, But he still arrived at 5 a.m. every morning, still carried a thermos of coffee, still preferred to work when the building was quiet. The difference was what he did during those early morning hours. Victor stood before a whiteboard that stretched the length of the lab wall, covered in equations that would power the most ambitious Mars mission in human history. The mathematical frameworks he developed with his team over the past months represented breakthroughs in fuel efficiency, atmospheric entry systems, and landing precision that had accelerated SpaceX's timeline by years. But today's work was special. Today, Victor was finalizing the calculations for a propulsion system based entirely on ideas from Alexei's notebook. The 16-year-old's curiosity refined into engineering that would carry humans to another planet. Morning, Victor. Victor turned to see Dr. Sarah Chin entering the lab with her own cup of coffee. She joined SpaceX 3 months earlier as Victor's primary collaborator, bringing 30 years of practical engineering experience to complement his theoretical insights. Good morning, Sarah. I have finished the fuel mixture calculations. Sarah approached the whiteboard and studied Victor's work. Over the months, she learned to read his mathematical thinking like a language, recognizing the elegant precision that characterized everything he touched. These efficiency numbers, they're higher than we projected. Alexei's original concept was more sophisticated than I initially realized. His intuition about molecular combustion rates was remarkably accurate. Victor pointed to a section of equations written in different color markers. Blue is Alexei's foundational logic from 1991. Green is mathematical development I have added. Red is practical engineering applications Sarah has contributed. Together, we have created a propulsion system that exceeds NASA specifications by 23%. Sarah smiled. Working with Victor had taught her to see aerospace engineering as collaboration across time and expertise rather than individual brilliance. His insistence on crediting both his son's ideas and her practical contributions had created a research environment unlike anything she'd experienced. When do we test? Next month. Elon wants full prototype ready for Mars mission integration by December. They worked in comfortable silence for an hour, refining calculations that would soon become hardware. Victor had discovered that returning to physics after 27 years was like speaking a language he'd never forgotten. The mathematics came back to him with startling clarity, but now tempered by decades of understanding how much scientific ambition could cost. At 7 a.m., other engineers began arriving for the day's shift. Victor had worried initially about working with people young enough to be his children, but he'd found that his combination of theoretical knowledge and practical humility made him an effective teacher rather than an intimidating genius. Dr. Petrov? A young engineer named David approached the whiteboard. Could you explain the combustion chamber pressure calculations? I'm having trouble following the variable relationships. Victor spent 20 minutes walking David through mathematics, using the patient clarity he'd once brought to graduate students in Moscow. Teaching reminded him daily why he loved physics in the first place. Not for personal glory, but for the joy of sharing understanding that could change the world. When the explanation was finished, David thanked him and returned to his workstation. Victor watched him apply the concepts they discussed, remembering similar moments with Alexei when his son would work through problems with the same intense focus. He reminds you of him, doesn't he? Sarah said quietly. All of them do. They have same excitement, same belief that mathematics can solve any problem. Victor paused. Alexei would have loved working here. He is working here. Every calculation you do carries his ideas forward. Victor nodded, returning to the whiteboard where his son's dreams were becoming engineering reality. 9 months later, Elon Musk stood at a podium in SpaceX's main auditorium, addressing an audience of engineers, journalists, and aerospace industry leaders. Behind him, a massive screen displayed technical specifications for the Mars mission scheduled to launch in 6 weeks. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Word had leaked that SpaceX was announcing breakthrough propulsion technology, and the aerospace community had responded with intense curiosity. NASA administrators sat in the front row alongside executives from Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Blue Origin. International delegations from ESA, JAXA, and Roscosmos have flown in to hear details of innovations that could reshape the entire industry. Today, I want to tell you about a breakthrough in propulsion technology that will fundamentally change how we approach interplanetary travel. Elon began. The Petrovskian propulsion system represents a 30% improvement in fuel efficiency and a 40% improvement in landing precision over any existing technology. The audience murmured with interest. Breakthrough announcements were common in the aerospace industry, but numbers like these suggested something genuinely revolutionary. Several attendees began taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would be studied and referenced for decades. What makes this system remarkable isn't just its performance, it's its origin story. Elon clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a worn notebook. This technology began as a high school physics project in Moscow, 1991. A 16-year-old boy named Alexei Petrov was experimenting with rocket fuel mixtures, trying to prove that science belongs to everyone, not just one country. Victor sat in the back of the auditorium, watching Elon tell his son's story to the world. He'd arrived early and chosen a seat where he could observe without being easily noticed. Old habits from 27 years of invisibility. Beside him, Sarah took notes on her laptop, occasionally glancing at Victor to make sure he was comfortable with the public attention. Dr. Rodriguez sat on Victor's other side, equally protective of their colleagues' privacy while recognizing the historical significance of this moment. The atmospheric entry technology they developed together will be presented today to the global aerospace community, marking Victor's official return to the physics world that had once destroyed his life. Alexei never got to finish his project. He died that winter, a casualty of political persecution that also destroyed his father's career. Elon's voice grew serious, but his idea survived in a notebook his father carried for 27 years, developing those teenage insights into mathematical frameworks that will power our Mars mission. Victor felt a familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone mentioned Alexei's death. But this time, the pain was tempered by profound gratitude that his son's dreams were finally being acknowledged by the international scientific community. The boy who had died for believing that science could unite the world was being posthumously recognized as a contributor to humanity's greatest adventure. The slide changed to show Victor and Sarah working at the laboratory whiteboard, their calculations visible in blue, green, and red markers. Dr. Victor Petrov, Alexei's father, spent decades working manual labor jobs while secretly advancing his son's propulsion theories. Dr. Sarah Chun brought the practical engineering expertise needed to turn theory into hardware. Dr. James Rodriguez provided the atmospheric dynamics knowledge that made implementation possible. Together, they created technology that honors both scientific collaboration and personal loss. Victor noticed that Elon had carefully credited the entire team rather than focusing on individual genius. This approach reflected conversations they'd had about how breakthrough innovations emerge from collaborative effort rather than isolated brilliance. Victor had insisted on this framing, unwilling to accept recognition that didn't acknowledge everyone who contributed to the work. Elon clicked to a video of the prototype engine test from the previous month. The audience watched fuel combustion patterns that had never been achieved before, landing system precision that looked almost supernatural, and efficiency readings that redefined what was possible. The test footage showed a scale model spacecraft equipped with a Petrovskian propulsion system executing maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. The atmospheric entry sequence demonstrated energy conversion that turned thermal friction into directional thrust, allowing the craft to adjust its trajectory with unprecedented accuracy while actually gaining energy from the entry process rather than losing it. The mathematics underlying this system were first conceived by a teenager who wanted to prove that scientific knowledge belonged to all humanity. Elon continued. They were refined by a father who spent 27 years honoring his son's memory through patient, careful research. They were implemented by a team that understood that the best innovations come from combining theoretical insight with practical expertise. Victor felt tears on his cheeks for the first time in decades, not from sadness, but from profound satisfaction of watching his son's dreams become reality in ways neither of them could have imagined. Alexei's belief that science could unite rather than divide humanity was being validated in front of representatives from every major spacefaring nation on Earth. During the question and answer session that followed, a reporter from Aviation Week asked about the specific mathematical innovations that made the new propulsion system possible. Dr. Petrov developed theoretical frameworks in the early 1990s that were decades ahead of practical implementation, Elon explained. His son Alexei identified practical applications that Dr. Petrov has been refining ever since. The current system represents the culmination of 30 years of theoretical development and 18 months of intensive collaborative engineering. A NASA administrator asked about technology transfer and international cooperation. Will this system be available to other space agencies? Elon glanced toward the back of the auditorium where Victor sat. They discussed this question extensively, and Victor had been adamant about his answer. Dr. Petrov has insisted that the Petrovchin system be made available to any organization committed to peaceful space exploration. His son believed that science should unite humanity, and we're honoring that vision by sharing this technology with international partners who share our commitment to expanding human presence in space. Victor smiled, remembering Alexei's letter about wanting to build spacecraft that brought people together instead of keeping them apart. The decision to share rather than hoard the propulsion technology felt like the most appropriate way to honor his son's memory. An ESA representative asked about future developments and applications beyond Mars missions. The Petrovchin propulsion system is the first practical implementation of theoretical frameworks that have much broader applications. Elon replied, Dr. Petrov and his team are already working on adaptations for Jupiter missions, asteroid mining operations, and eventually interstellar exploration. The mathematical foundations his son identified 30 years ago may turn out to be the key to expanding human civilization throughout the solar system. After the presentation, journalists clustered around Elon with questions about technical specifications and launch timelines. Victor slipped out of the auditorium through a side door, preferring to avoid the attention that came with public recognition. He walked his Honda, parked in the same spot where he'd sat for 18 months reading physics journals and hiding from his own expertise. But the car would serve a different purpose now. Tomorrow morning, it would take him to the hill overlooking the launch site, but not to watch alone. Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez, and several other team members had asked to join him for the engine test, wanting to witness the first firing of a propulsion system they'd helped create. Victor opened Alexei's notebook and read the final entry his son had written the day he died. Physics is not about being right. Physics is about asking questions that help everyone understand the universe better. Someday I want to work on spacecraft that bring people together instead of keeping them apart. He closed the notebook and looked up at the SpaceX building where those words were becoming reality. Through the windows, he could see journalists interviewing Elon about the Mars mission, engineers discussing implementation timelines, and administrators from multiple countries exploring collaboration opportunities. Alexei's dream of science uniting humanity was happening exactly as a 16-year-old idealism had envisioned. That evening, Victor received a phone call that surprised him. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, the Russian physicist who had been credited with Victor's stolen research, was calling from Moscow. Viktor Petrovich, The familiar voice said in Russian, "I have been watching the news about your work at SpaceX." Victor hadn't spoken of Volkov in 34 years. The man who had benefited from Victor's forced exile now sounded old and tired. "What do you want, Mikhail?" "I want to apologize. What happened to you in 1991, it was not right. I knew the theoretical frameworks credited to me were your work. I should have refused the attribution, should have demanded that your name remain on the research." Victor sat in his small kitchen, processing words he'd never expected to hear. "I was young and ambitious and afraid," Volkov continued. "I told myself that preserving the research was more important than protecting your reputation. I convinced myself that scientific progress mattered more than individual credit. And now I am an old man who realizes that science without integrity is not science at all. I have written a letter to Russian Academy of Sciences, formally acknowledging that theoretical propulsion frameworks attributed to me from 1992 to 1995 were based entirely on your previous research. I am requesting that historical record be corrected." Victor felt a weight he'd carried for 3 decades beginning to lift. "This will not bring back my son, Mikhail. No, nothing can do that. But perhaps it can restore the reputation that should never have been taken from you." They talked for another 10 minutes about the changes in Russian science, the end of the political pressures that had destroyed Victor's career, and the possibility of future collaboration between Russian and American space programs. Volkov mentioned that several of his former students were now working for Roscosmos and were eager to learn about the Petrovchin propulsion system. "Your son's dream of science uniting nations. It is coming true," Volkov said before ending the call. "Even from Moscow, we can see that." After hanging up, Victor sat in the quiet of his kitchen, thinking about forgiveness, redemption, and the strange ways that time could heal wounds that seemed permanent. The phone call didn't change the past, but it offered something Victor hadn't expected to receive: acknowledgement that injustice had been done and recognition that his contributions to science deserved to be remembered. The next morning, Victor drove to the hill overlooking the launch site with a carload of colleagues who had become friends. As they set up chairs and telescopes to watch the propulsion system test, Victor felt surrounded by the kind of scientific community Alexei had dreamed about: international, collaborative, focus on discovery rather than competition. When the test rocket ignited and began its demonstration flight, Victor held his son's photograph and watched mathematics become reality. The spacecraft executed maneuvers that proved every calculation they developed validated theoretical frameworks that had begun in a teenager's imagination and been refined through a father's love. As the rocket disappeared into California's sky, carrying the dreams of a boy who had died believing science could change the world, Victor realized that some victories took decades to achieve, but were worth every year of patient work required to make them real. 2 years later, the first crewed Mars mission launched on a clear morning in December. Victor watched from his usual spot on the hill, surrounded by Sarah, David, and a dozen other engineers who'd worked on the Petrovchin propulsion system. As the rocket cleared the atmosphere and began its journey toward another planet, Victor held Alexei's photograph and whispered, "We did it, son." The mission succeeded beyond all projections. Landing precision was perfect. Fuel efficiency exceeded specifications. The propulsion system performed flawlessly throughout the 6-month journey, proving that a teenager's curiosity, refined by his father's love and a team's collaborative expertise, could literally reach other worlds. Victor never gave interviews about the mission's success. He continued working quietly in the SpaceX lab, developing new approaches to deep space propulsion while mentoring young engineers who reminded him daily why science mattered. His name appeared on technical papers, always linked with Alexei's, but he avoided conferences and public appearances. 3 months after the Mars mission's successful conclusion, Victor's colleagues arrived at the lab one morning to find he hadn't come to work. Sarah drove to his apartment and discovered that Victor had died peacefully in his sleep. Alexei's notebook opened on his bedside table to the final entry about bringing people together through exploration. At his funeral, attended by SpaceX engineers, former Soviet physicists who'd flown in from around the world, and NASA officials who'd studied his work, Elon spoke about a man who'd understood that true brilliance wasn't about personal recognition, but about contributions that outlived the contributor. The week after the funeral, Sarah returned to the lab to find a message Victor had left on a whiteboard in his distinctive handwriting. Balance before brilliance. Remember that science serves humanity, not the other way around. V. Petrov. She erased everything else on the board, but left that message. It remained there as younger engineers joined the team, working on propulsion systems that would carry humans to Jupiter's moons and beyond, building on mathematical foundations laid by a father who'd never stopped believing in his son's dreams. The final Mars colony ship launched 5 years later, powered by advanced Petrovsky systems that had evolved far beyond the original design. As it disappeared into the darkness between worlds, carrying 200 pioneers toward humanity's first permanent settlement on another planet, Victor's words remain on a laboratory whiteboard, reminding everyone who saw them that the greatest discoveries come not from individual genius, but from love that transcends loss and collaboration that spans generations. Somewhere in the vastness between Earth and Mars, spacecraft flew through the void carrying the dreams of a 16-year-old boy who believed science could unite the world, powered by mathematics developed by a father who'd spent 27 years proving that love was stronger than grief, and that brilliance unshared was brilliance wasted. The universe, as Alexei had once written, belonged to everyone. And finally, through his father's courage and the team's dedication, everyone could reach for the stars.